Yep, perfect.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of our webinar series hosted by Vic No-TIll, focusing on relevant issues around soil carbon through a closer look at strategies to increase organic matter. This project is supported by the Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. We would like to thank them very much for their support. For those that missed last week's webinar with Graeme, we have it recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel. Today we're fortunate enough again to be joined by Graeme. This is part 5 of his 6-part series. Graeme is one of Australia's leading holistic land management and training consultants who has over 25 years of planned grazing experience and holistic management training. Same thing again with today. If you've got any questions, please type them into the Q&A box down the bottom and Graeme will address them as we go if we have time at the end, time for a few questions at the end as well. So, righto, we'll get into it. So, thanks very much, Graeme.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just share my screen here. See, can you see that screen? I'm just trying to.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, it's wanting to. Has it got that zoom thing in front of it? So
it does. Yep. I reckon just hit the cross. I reckon. That's
yeah. Right. How's that?
Yep.
Welcome everyone to another week of the online grazing workshops. I was going to review a few things and just make it really clear what I think we need to do to address soil carbon and to increase landscape function and start shifting and going to a redesign for your farming, so that you actually sort of are more resilient and able to cope with changes. So again, just, this is what I use as my universal for regenerative grazing, holistic management. So just a simple direction of change for what you're trying to do. So each day I find that if you increase landscape function every time you do something, that eventually you have very high landscape function rather than making it a campaign to increase landscape function. So everything you do must be thinking about, how do I increase landscape function and biodiversity? How do I get low risk profit? The thing that everyone seems to be missing is the risk that's sucking the money out of the business. So, I rely heavily on Tim Hutchings' work, sort of showing that risk is really what we're missing. That's the one that we're sort of missing all the time. And it needs to be, how do I design it so that, heads I win, tails I win. So what's that sort of design? And then people well-being scores. So, and I found that people that are actually starting to shift their management towards more resilient, lower cost, using practices that actually restore the land, have higher well-being scores, and they tend to want to actively promote agriculture. So just a quick one, and always sort of good to start with. And decisions should be made towards that. Does this lower my risk? So does it lower my debt, rainfall and market price risk? And, is it going to reduce my workload, or is it work that I enjoy, or is it going to be a heavier workload? This idea, sorry, I'll just get my pointer. This one here is what I'm talking about, this change. When we change things, we seem to focus on 3 levels. So efficiency, then substitution, then redesign. So every time someone's talking to me, and I'd suggest it's a good thing to do when you're having advisors or anyone come in, at what level are they talking to you about the business? So I'm arguing that we need to go for redesign, but you also need to be able to do some efficiency and substitution. So the example that I use is efficiency would be putting a coating on the urea so that it doesn't volatilize and you don't lose as much. Substitution might be using a composted chicken manure or pelletized thing. So there's a lot of advice that goes under that substitution level. But redesign is, how do I redesign the way I do this enterprise so that I don't need the nitrogen fertilizer? So that's the key. Some of this needs to be done in safe to fail trials. How do I get there? So the easy example, and the one I repeatedly use, is Gabe Brown grows corn without using nitrogen fertilizer because he's increased the landscape function and has that decomposing litter, and using those cover crops, those multi-species cover crops, to actually get enough nitrogen in the soil. Then using a Haney soil test to check what he needs to add, and if he needs to add anything to grow the crop that he wants to do. So I'm saying that most of the advice that you'll get from the current universities and departments of ag and things like that, they're about efficiency. That's the level that they think at. How do we make the current system more efficient? And so they'll always be talking about technology to reduce P, or measuring the soil better, but not actually changing the soil surface. This one here is really just about I'm pretty dismissive of it, and I probably shouldn't be, but I think of it as changing from a toxic aspirin to a less benign aspirin. So, going from replacing nitrogen fertilizer with composted chicken manure is still not redesigning it so that you don't need to use it. Doesn't really redesign out of that whole cost thing that I put up with the declining terms of trade. And redesign would be, as I've just said, changing the soil surface. That's what we manage. And I'll just change a few of these things around. And I talk about increasing landscape function. Gabe and Colin and others talk about the ground cover or soil armour and decomposing litter. So landscape function, David Tongway and Norm Hindley, stands the test of time. The USDA is using it more and more. It's great work. And I'll just quickly skim through it. If we want to increase stability, reduce erosion, increase water infiltration, and increase nutrient cycling, then we need to have the ground covered for stability. We need that basal cover of mature perennial grasses. So about 20 to, in a grazing system, it needs to be perennial grass. It's the only one that's low enough cost and resilient enough and long enough growing times that you can make a grazing system profitable. Most of the cropping area grazing systems are not perennial grass based, and they have too high a costs, too high a requirement for fertilizer, etc. So for water infiltration, basal cover of the perennial grasses, litter cover again to break up the drops and surface roughness, and that's over 1 metre. You need about 8 mils from the highest to the lowest point over 1 metre when we're doing a transect. And it's usually the best is if it's the base of a perennial grass that's above the soil surface, just to hold up the water. Nutrient cycling, which is crucial if you want to increase soil carbon, you must increase nutrient cycling. So if you want to increase soil structure, you've got to increase nutrient cycling. If you want to lower your costs, you've got to increase nutrient cycling. So this is the really big one that we need to focus on. Again, in a grazing system, basal cover of perennial grass, then that composting, sheet composting of the litter between the plants. So it needs, as a minimum, to have slight decomposition of the litter. So it's breaking down, forming smaller bits, turning brown. It needs to be breaking down. I go to a lot of properties and they've only got grey oxidizing crop residue. Nothing's breaking down, nothing's cycling. And then they go, I have a problem with it having ever increasing fertilizer requirement. And it's not a mystery. It's not something that we shouldn't know. So that sheet composting of the litter, and the surface roughness. So, I'm happy to take any questions or comments. In a cropping system, you're creating that, but without the basal cover of perennial grass. So basically, what the cover croppers and the good grazing people are doing is leaving that one on the table because they need to do their cash cropping. So they're getting that sort of litter cover, complete 100% litter cover, deep, stable litter that's decomposing at the soil surface, and they've got some surface roughness. You can't leave one of these behind, though. There's a lot of advice sort of that seems to be, I'll focus on water, or I'll focus on nutrients. You need all three going at once. So David Tongway reminded me of that the other day. So when I get off track, it's always good to get some reinforcement. So there, all the relationships, peer reviewed. You can't get away from it, and people keep trying to wriggle out of it. And I want to do this. Well, the land really doesn't care what we want to do. I was talking up at Bombala last week, and I was saying that as far as I can tell, that the land and the grasses are completely disinterested in what we're trying to achieve. So the land and the grasses just are, and we need to design around that. If you want to increase soil carbon, you must increase nutrient cycling index. So I'm looking at this one here, this rangeland graph here. So this work is all being done by David Tongway. And what they show is that as you increase that nutrient cycling index, so increasing perennial grass basal area, decomposing litter, and surface roughness, you increase total organic carbon. Now, some people can't reproduce that, but when I look at the way they sampled, they don't sample total organic carbon like David Tongway did. They actually had a very expensive technique of digging trenches and taking samples out of the wall of that trench. And when you do that, it's incredibly accurate for soil carbon. If you're doing the standard methodology for soil carbon, it's incredibly random. The results may or may not show significance. So, because what's happening is that most of our topsoils are very shallow in Australia, as everyone knows, and there's a variation in topsoil depth. So some areas, and everyone that's drilled post holes knows this, fence post holes, some areas you'll get 30 centimetres of topsoil, some areas you'll get 2 centimetres of topsoil. So that confuses that the results and ends up showing no significant difference. So I think we've got a big problem with the way we do that. I've tried to raise it with everyone. But they go, oh, that's why we combine the samples, Graeme, to cope with that variation. But it doesn't cope with it. It just means that it's hidden within that composite sample. So that was a discussion I've had with CSIRO, DPIs, everyone. So, and they really don't listen to me. So this has been confirmed. So work I did with Peter Ampt and Sarah Dombas, this was looking at people that had adopted management that increased landscape function. At the time, it was grazing management. This was in sort of central, west and southern New South Wales on this big project we were on. And these are the averages. The figures were actually on some farms were much higher. So it was a fence line comparison between people that were set stocking and people that were doing some planned grazing. I would argue that it wasn't the best grazing management, but I tend to be a bit extreme on that. So, but what we found was without adding lime on the innovators, they had higher pHs, 0 to 2, 2 to 5 to 5 to 10. They had higher phosphorus without adding phosphorus because they were accessing the phosphorus bank. You increase landscape function, you increase nutrient cycling, you increase biological activity in the soil, you can access the P that's available in the soil that's not plant available. So I don't see that as being any mystery. what we've found over, we've got farms over 20 years that continue to show this difference between people adding phosphorus and people focusing on increasing landscape function. But you can't get it. You can't get at these things without actually doing something. And people are starting to realise that you've got to do the trials, you've got to do the safe to fails, you've got to work out what works on your land. And I'll keep coming back to that. They got more nitrogen, usually as biological nitrogen, so it doesn't leak. One of the reasons you can increase the soil pH is because you're not leaking nitrates out the bottom of the soil profile. So, you need to have it bound up as life, as amino acids in the soil. And then they also had more carbon. And again, I'd like to sort of focus people on that. They sampled at 0 to 2, 2 to 5, and 5 to 10. So they're actually sort of really being very accurate at what they do. It's incredibly expensive and it's not practical to do over broad areas. But when you do that, when you make sure that you're not mixing organic matter into the soil organic carbon, these are the results you get. So I advised the Stiper membership when we were doing this work that don't sign up to too many projects at the moment, because in theory, you could go around and get deep soil carbons the first time because you've got deep soil, topsoil. And then the next time, even though you averaged across that whole hectare, you've increased carbon, but you sample all the shallow ones. And I'm happy to discuss that and happy to take any emails and comments and questions and criticisms, etc. So, this is really sort of just based on my experience and trying to get this to work. So, there's no questions on that. So it's pretty clear. You increase nutrient cycling, you increase soil carbon, but you also increase pH, phosphorus and nitrogen availability. So this is out south of Cobar, out on the Kidman Way. This is Andrew and Megan Mosley. So they did like a no-kill cropping. So if you want to increase soil carbon the fastest, the best thing to do is to go from a cropping system to a perennial grass system. So this was all pretty well bare, typical Cobar country, red topsoil or subsoil as far as the eye can see. So they did a mechanical intervention, which I'm not a fan of, but this worked. You can't knock that it worked. I tend to think that we generally want a mechanical or an engineering solution to biological problems. But what they did was they did like a pasture crop of oats. When they grazed it down, they didn't take the oats all the way down, and they left it quite a high stubble and residue. And then this is what germinated and then filled in with their management. So, this is pretty extraordinary for out there. But it was, when Andrew and I were talking about it, it cost a fair bit of money to do that over broad scale. But the result was absolutely amazing. One of the things is they go on these low rainfall zones. They're very slow to accumulate carbon. I go, yes, they are, but they've got incredible capacity to store carbon. So there's like the whole profile's empty. So it's just unlimited what you can do. I've been arguing on another forum that in these environments, do you go for a mechanical intervention or do you just use the animals? And I've been saying the problem is that we can't get the recovery stock density and plant utilisation. So I'm saying we need more trials on how do we regenerate these areas, these large areas of Central Australia without intervening with diesel and a mechanical intervention. So happy to take calls on that. So we did this back in the early 2000s. And it was just a soil test. So, it doesn't stand up to sort of like, it wasn't a peer-reviewed experiment. This is what the soil did when it shifted. You'd be surprised if it didn't increase in organic soil carbon. But, just using the soil test results from, down to 100 meters, 100 mil, it went from 0.6 to 0.8. So what that meant, though, was that it was, like this was how much soil it represented. This is how much increase it was, converting that back into CO2 equivalents. How much soil was it? How much carbon or CO2 equivalents was it? Sorry, getting all funneled. And, so, people can argue that I've got that wrong. I have no problem with that, but it increased, and they're pretty big areas. So, but what that meant was if that's correct, that 4,800 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum, what was their emission? So at the time, I used Richard Eckhard's greenhouse accounting tool from Melbourne University just to get their emissions. So this was the methane, the electricity, the diesel. I put the lot in, and it was completely lower. So I'll finish the story. So the net carbon captured was 4,000 tonnes, and it's approximately 5 times the amount captured versus emitted. So, it needs someone that does this sort of work to do this, to sort of go and say, oh, okay, because at the moment, what I hear is that the methane emissions swamp anything you can do. And we did this a long time ago and tried to get people interested in that. If you change that red topsoil look to grassland, then you actually swamp the emissions of the animals. So I see this as a good news story. Everyone else just sort of, I don't know what they hear. But I did some work on Colin Syce's pasture cropping, and it got worse. So we reduced the nitrogen by about a third. We weren't burning, and it actually got worse. So I rang Richard Eckhard and said, hey, Richard, what's going on with this thing? How can this be? But all the litter and material that we had on the soil from Cole's pasture cropping, they put that up as all emitted because it was all going to oxidize. But this is one of the other things that if you're reading any research and they're using the Roth-Amstead carbon model, it's outdated. It's all about carbon in, carbon out. So unless you actually material that's grown above the ground into the soil, it's basically in a cropping system. So and a lot of the time it's got no decomposition of the litter at the soil surface. So then it's all put back up into the atmosphere. So and they had to use, and Richard, I need to finish and make it clear, Richard Eckhard had to use those sort of models at the time because that was the only data and information they had. I think we've moved on from that. We know that system isn't accurate, so you can't use the Roth-C model is what I'm trying to get to. So anyway, what I want just to reinforce is these safe-to-fail trials. I won't go through all the words, but this is from Dave Snowden. And I think that it's really important. This first line really works for me. Before opinions harden, you create a very simple decision rule. Everyone with an idea that has even the remotest possibility of being true or useful creates a safe-to-fail experiment based on the idea. Doesn't have to prove, but it just has to be consistent and coherent with the science. So my argument is that in the complex area where we're working in farm families, we're doing research on biological systems, conflict is what's going to cause all the problems. And I run into this a lot. When I say I can take that area and put it back to perennial grassland in 1 to 2 years, most people go, I don't think so. So the one I'm thinking of is the Benjamin Sale in Somaliland. No one, before they see that video, would predict that it would go back to a perennial grassland in 12 months. So I'm saying before opinions harden, which I think is sort of some sort of nanosecond, you've got to actually start to say everyone with an idea can put it up. I have a problem with this because I've tried so many things that I go, oh, I don't think that'll work. But you've got to stop yourself from doing that and just say, let's do a small safe to fail trial and be inclusive when you're trying to do this. So I have people that say, I'm going to try, extra fertilizer. I go, fine. I go, I don't think that'll work in my head, but I just go, fine, let's do it. Let's do it in a safe to fail trial. You've got the outcome's got to be observable. You've got to know what you're measuring. So all my safe to fail trials, I go, does it increase landscape function? Because that's what the science says, and it's coherent with that science. So, so if you can observe it, then you actually know that you can go ahead. So if people are arguing and in conflict, the best thing to do is let's do a trial. How are we going to do it? And what are we going to measure? And the person that comes up with the idea is responsible for designing the trial and the experiment. So, sorry, I missed the chat. So, thanks, Lon. The experiments are then reviewed, and so if you want any more details, I'll send out those to Dan on just doing the grazing. I'll be really clear that cover crops only make sense if you're cash cropping. So we need to be really clear that sort of if you're just going to be grazing in that area, it needs to be a perennial grassland. If you're just cropping in that area, then cover crops might be a good idea. Just another slide. So complex systems are understood by how we interact with them. So you've got to have contradictory, you've got to have a portfolio. You need 20% of them to fail, but I'll pop that into the notes so that people can look at it at a later date. So just back to this. So using safe to fail trials to determine the recovery, stock density and plant utilisation. 95%, or lately I've been sort of trying to do that 9 in 10 grazing consultants that say don't utilise the plants too much and you'll get leaf-driven recovery. I'm saying that no, I don't find that to be true, but confirm it to yourself using the safe to fail trials. So I'm saying that when you get started on this, a long recovery with high stock density and high plant utilisation will get you on the right track to increasing landscape function. So, you can get, improvements in landscape function with other grazing methods, but I'm saying check is what's best for my land, leaf-driven recovery or root reserve-driven recovery. The leaf-driven recovery is not very drought tolerant. It runs out. I was talking to a guy, Pete Blair, in New Zealand this week, and he said that when he was doing the leaf driven, he gave it a real crack, and as soon as it got too dry, it'd fall over. Now he's going to root reserve driven recovery and making sure that he's got good drought resilience and stuff like that. He's always got feed in front of him, never run out of grass. So I've been trying to think of an analogy, because most people just think I'm a kook when I say that. So the analogy I came up with was with talking to someone the other day, Peter Donovan from Washington State in the US, was that root reserve-driven recovery is not favoured because of Frank Kreider's research talking about root death. And so I said to him, I need some way of describing this to people that makes sense. They don't understand that that's a good thing. And so what I came up with is that it's like people saying to me, I'm not going to exercise because I get muscle tears and some muscle fibre death. So I'm not going to exercise. everyone that knows that we don't build muscles, we don't maintain sort of our whole bodies without exercise. You need some damage to the muscle fibers and tissues to actually stay healthy. And I'm arguing that the root reserve driven recovery is very similar to that. Don't know whether that works for anyone. If anyone could comment, that'd be fantastic. But, you know, what's the parallel between the root reserve recovery and exercise is that you must do some damage to get it to stay healthy. But trying to avoid the damage and never exercising is not going to work. But I don't know whether it works as a description for people or not. So, but, you know, happy to try anything. So then go from using these small safe to fail trials. I've got an updated photo of Stephen Hobbs' trial, which I'm saying everyone needs to be really engaged with and see what happens. Can he get it back to a perennial grassland? What does it take? What happens? Then you do some strips, and Stephen's going to do that on one of those. So you've got to develop convenient infrastructure. Just leased a property down in Gippsland, and I was working on that yesterday. So how can we put in that flexible strip fencing and flexible water? They've got really good groundwater, but it's as flat as a tack, and no way of pressurising it at the moment. So we're looking at how do we shift that. So it's been a sheep property for 3 generations, and I'm coming in and going to do this, and I want to capture it and record it and do video diaries and how we do all that so that people can keep on top of that. So don't keep subdividing paddocks. Don't even think about that, because you can't do enough subdivision of paddocks to actually to make this work. I would do that safe to fail trial of paddock of strips with electric fencing. Having said that, the Coglins at Holbrook and Narandra or Miranda, they use they've kept subdividing paddocks, but they've also kept expanding, so that now when they buy a new place, the paddocks are nearly the right size. So they have don't use electric fencing. They have normal hard fences and a dam in each paddock. So yeah, so the last time I was there at Holbrook, they had 180 paddocks, and Michael said, and a dam in 179 of them. So, and because they've got a mob of 2,000 cows or thereabouts there, and a similar bigger mob out at Miranda, they actually struggle to use troughs and things like that. So there's big troughs and dams and an irrigation sort of water in at Miranda, but they just use dams at Holbrook. So that works well. Cows and calves, they make a fortune out of it. So, well, yeah, they have very low cost of production, about 80 cents a kilo live weight on what they're producing. And then selecting animal phenotypes. So this process of doing landscape function grazing or grazing for carbon or whatever is really tricky. And I keep thinking that these steps are difficult. You know, you've got to be prepared to know how to do safe to fail trials. It can be really low cost, really easy, but you've got to do them, keep them locked up so that you've continually got high quality feedback. The right infrastructure. If it's too hard, it just doesn't work. You know, it's about all that sort of, you know, have we got the right yards? Have we got the right laneways? You know, how do I make this enjoyable to do rather than, oh God, I've got to go out and shift the sheep. And then the animals have got to be the right phenotypes. And I think that, sorry, I went too quick. The animals phenotypes is a really big issue. And I think you've got to be a breeder and select animals that perform under your management. And you've got to do the individual animal ID work with with sheep. Just quickly, as you increase recovery, you increase those soil surface indicators. You increase recovery, so time out of the paddock, cover, basal cover, litter, increases the degree of composting and also allows the basal grasses to grow and get more surface roughness. Stock density, puts germinates things, germinates perennial grasses, and increases the degree of composting, because as you build up more litter, you actually need to push it in more firmly onto the soil surface to maintain that composting. Otherwise, it'll start to float. And plant utilisation, you've got to clear the throats of the grasses. So First Nations burning was all about clearing the throats, getting that litter out there. They can't drop their leaves. They choke themselves out and then become, there's a tendency to become a woody weed or a tree. And then that plant utilisation also stimulates the crown. So you're only going into the land occasionally, and you're doing a full exercise and then recovery before you come back and do it again. And the time scale is what you determine by your safe to fail trials, but do one at least at 12 months, because it seems that litter decomposition and everything increases around about there, out there somewhere. That's all the relationships. And then if you increase these areas, you increase recovery, increase stock density, increase utilisation, you'll increase stability, water infiltration, nutrient cycling. I thought that was some of my best work, but most people think it's death by PowerPoint. So decomposing litter is the common link. I'll just quickly skip through these. The life cycle of a grass. This is when perennial grasses are toxic, because this leaf is actively growing from root reserves. If you eat this plant here, so it's got to be grazed down and then regrow. It's the regrowth that you're grazing that causes the problem. So there's nothing wrong with utilising well, in my world, but 9 out of 10 sort of grazing advisors disagree. And then this is where most of the damage is done. You won't kill the grass plant, you won't build landscape function. It's only here that you increase landscape function and increase soil health. So I'll just put that definition in. Looks like an ungrazed plant and contains fresh litter. Oops, sorry, I got this one again. This is at Stephen Hobbs. So yeah, just the dates. So this was the original trampling. This was May, and this was sort of early June. So yeah, it would be interesting to follow. And we're keeping photos of across the paddock as well as down into the paddock that I haven't included in here. So just a small area, grazed at high stock density, pushed all the litter back down onto the ground, and then trying to promote that germination of perennials through that stock density and utilisation, and then giving it long enough for recovery so that anything that does germinate gets to establish. So we've been predicting that the net farm would start to taper off, but they're still saying that this is an estimate for 21 and this is an estimate for 22. So this is the latest data out of ABARES. This was June 22 and this was March 22, and they're still looking very much the same. But if anything, it's probably gone up a little bit on the gross farm income. I'm hoping, because I've gone out and told a lot of people, this has come back a little bit, their estimate, sort of just on 20 billion, sorry, and this was above 21 something or other. So I'm assuming this is going to flatten out, because that's the trend. That the net value of farm production always is declining and doesn't keep up with the gross value of farm production. So there is no examples of it not doing that, the declining terms of trade. So I'm assuming ABARES has got this wrong, their estimates, and that this will flatten even more. I'd like to be wrong, but I've never seen that happen, and it's not in the data anywhere. So we need to know that this gap between here, this is the latest one, this gap between here and here is inputs, and then when you throw interest in with the increasing debt, that's going the wrong way. So farm, we've got to minimise losses rather than maximise production. Just wanted to get quickly into some of the financials. So these slides I've shown you before, the big risks are debt, seasonal and market price. So we have a formal process that Alan Savory came up with of planning a profit. So what profit do you need? What's stopping progress? Look at the current enterprises. Do you need new sources of income? If you're going to go for that new sources of income, can they be decoupled from seasonal risk, rainfall risk? And then you want simple, low-risk enterprises. Determine the weak link, categorise the expenses, pay yourself first, and then do the whole farm cash flow. What I get people to start with is this monthly variance to budget. Within the first week of the month, you have a structured meeting to determine what corrective action to be taken to get the profit plan back on track. So this is really the step to start with. So there's a lot of other things that we do. They're pretty obvious and they're very valuable, but this is the thing to start with. Start doing that monthly variance to budget and having a meeting, and I'll show you the form we use to get the profit plan back on track. But you've got to develop a profitable plan, and then you've got to keep it on track. So we start, this is, I borrowed this from Mark Gardner up at Vanguard in Dubbo. So just a profit target, what wages, what debt, what reinvestment, what longer term savings. So you actually get an idea of what profit do you actually need to run the business. Very simple stuff, but it gives people, and it's usually a bigger number than what people imagine. So I like to actually sort of mess with people because they usually find that on most properties it's well and truly over what they're currently doing. So they don't have the money coming in for the long-term savings or the debt reduction. Yeah, so the farm usually, and this happens a lot, sort of less so on the bigger farms, but on the smaller farms, I find that, I find they're like a black hole, that any dollar that gets anywhere near the event horizon, it disappears down into the farm. So you really need to be saying, what is it that we need to do, and stop sort of letting the farm suck it all in. Because it's actually that longer term savings, super and debt reduction that are the keys for increasing the resilience of your farm business. And weak link is a bit of a sort of used as a bit of a joke just because the television's done this, but it's a very valuable idea. So this is Alan's idea on the weak link. So this is about resource to product to marketing. So just sort of where do you need to focus your expenses? Where do you need to focus to reinvest money to strengthen the business? So, that's all a bit dry and stuff, but I've tried to put a few examples in. So this was an organic dairy I worked with. They had lots of issues, and this is usually what's happening. So if you get a list of all the issues and categorize them into, is this about capturing sunlight or up that front end and feeding the animals? If the middle's the animals, then, and harvesting the product, do you know what's going on there? And then marketing it. If you're selling into the commodity market, there's very low return. There's very low return spending too much time on marketing. The best thing to do is to have a good agent. So, but then, when we went through all this, there was a lot of things going on, and there always is in every business. And this can actually act as a sort of clarifying what all the issues are and categorizing them. So some of these things, like cow health and pasture longevity and low landscape function was, leading to fertility falling, milk urea nitrogen cell count, and they're directly linked to that sort of recovery. Not long enough, you end up with that cell count and milk urea nitrogen and poor fertility. So if you're eating grass that's too young, it actually puts the cows into negative energy balance, and you end up sort of getting those things. So, and there was a really nice thing, but because it was an organic dairy, any feed bought in was incredibly expensive. So we decided to work on that. We wound out the recovery very slowly because they're pretty sensitive, these dairy cows. and you start to see these other things disappear. So the fertilizer requirement, the cow health improved, the fertility improved, the MUN, the milk urea nitrogen went down, the cell count, a lot of that. And also that meant reducing the numbers. So time to milk too long. So that still needed to be addressed in the future, and the dairy needed an update. But, starting to do that increased the money in the business. This is everywhere in the dairy literature that they're overstocked. And it's the same with the beef, sheep, and we're overcropping areas that we shouldn't be cropping. Yeah, so it is just universal. I don't understand how it can be so universal. It really just messes with my head. Why is this such a universal thing? So the one I quote is research they did at the Lincoln University Research Dairy. They decreased the numbers by 5% and increased the profit by 15%. But the milk went up as well. I'm happy to send those papers around. This is what you see all the time, that they're over-intensified, and backing off actually increases profit. You need to have that in you. It's got to be a profit focus, not a production focus, because otherwise you end up in these situations that you're over-intensified, which increases your debt exposure risk, your seasonal risk, and your market price risk. You need to know that. And I just don't know how to get it through, because we've taught for so long that production is everything, that we really, it's almost like, how can less be more? It just doesn't make sense. But all I do with the grazing people is take out 5 to 10% of their animals, and did the profit go up? If the profit went up, take out another 5 to 10%. It went up again, take out another 5 to 10%, and it's over the top of the curve and the profit goes down, put them back in. So it's finding that, working out what that is. It's putting the deep sands back to grazing with perennial grasses. It's having the right livestock. It's all those things. So they're big redesigns. They're not easy. This was just a cow, calf, again, stocking rate too high. And then sheep. I sort of only did this last night because I realised I couldn't find the examples I had for sheep. So this is a bit sort of what I'm trying to get people to start thinking about. So most of the time people have paddocks too big, too many mobs. They usually got problems with some sort of annual weedy thing, and they have poor water systems with pipes that are too sort of low in flow rate, so to actually make sort of big mobs work. So, this relies on making the grazing with the sheep, relies on being able to put them into one mob. I used to say, or a couple, but I don't anymore. Just one mob. Just have one mob. So they got lack of suitable animals. They'd like an auto drafter and individual management, and be sort of rating them in a league ladder of who's the most profitable. They struggle to get shearers, and there's problems with the shearing shed. So they tend to be, the yards need to be modified, and that can be usually low cost. And sort of, I always get people to look at Bud Williams videos so that they can get the sheep to run through the auto drafter. And they're sort of really usually struggling for time. So in the cropping sheep sort of areas, they're sort of flat out, and they've struggled to get focus a good agent. They struggle to get a good agent, because if they're just doing a commodity product, the key marketing issue is a good agent. So that's the thing. If you start going up to contract, sort of that you're supplying to a contract, you actually have to really increase your marketing skills. And then if you go to a branded product, you're responsible for everything. And you've really then got to really know. But if you're in the commodity market, selling either into the pools or the sale yards or whatever it is, then it's about it having a good agent. I think I've said that. Cropping, so this is what I see: increasing requirement for fertilizer, problems with dry finishes and frosts, herbicide resistance, getting good staff at the right time, sort of all those resource issues. Like, how do I actually get this soil to be becoming more resilient, coping with the dry finishes and the frosts? What's the right balance of grazing to cropping? How do I do all that? What's going on with that increasing requirement for fertilizer? How do I reverse that and start getting off that inputs, which is causing us all those problems with soil health and costs and declining terms of trade. So, and there's usually a whole heap of product issues: getting the crop off, getting the crop even, getting it through to finish. Everyone's always keen to update a tractor. I just sort of don't have it in me, but they've always wanting, every time I ask someone, they want to do that. And then breakdowns when they're getting it off, and the stress of that, and having enough delivery and storage and all those product issues. And then again, if you're just going into the pools, it's just a good agent. So we need to do that. So I say to people, don't worry about if you get them in the wrong category, as long as they're up there, whether it's a resource conversion or a product conversion or marketing, as long as you get them out, you can start thinking about, what should I be doing here so that I can get this sunlight that's on my land through to money? So this is this whole thing. It should, if you address the weak link in the business, you will get more money this year. So this is about, if you really need to be focused, you do need to do some things that are for the future, but you need to be saying, what can I do? Where can I focus my attention and my money, my expenses, so that I get more money out of at the other end? And a lot of the time, usually when you start working with people, there's a lot of resource issues. You get that going, you get more money, you can address the product issues. And then if you sort of only just marketing it into the commodity pool, then it's really just focusing on an agent. So I'll attach some blank forms or as well if you wanted to do it. But I'd be suggesting it's a really powerful way, and it almost gives you a list of thinking things to focus on. And I find that for my brain, it unscrambles that there's a whole list of things. So I'm starting to do this and really focus in on the lease property, because it's sort of on the edge of profitability and all that sort of stuff. So I've got to be very strategic about how I use money. Where's it going to? Making sure that I maintain the right staff, because I want to put a manager on there, so it's a special skill set that I need. So let me know if that's not clear, or if there's any comments or questions. This is I'll pull up in a couple of minutes. I've got 2 slides to go. So and then if there's any questions or comments or whatever, we can go from there. So this is this monthly corrective action. So if you're struggling for profit, I'm saying start doing this. Start doing any form of budget. Maybe think about the weak links, work out how much profit you need, all that sort of stuff. But just start, even if it's last year's budget. What's happening this year? What happened in the last month? So this has got to be done very early into the new month. It's very easy to do now. If you can't get this done, that you get that variance to budget report, I'm saying give yourself 2 months. If you don't get time to do it, get the accountant or the bookkeeper to do it. So don't stress about it. And the reason I state that is that when I worked in London for ICI Chemicals, when I worked in London, we, on a weekly basis, got the variance to budget for the world. All the places that we sold into. But we didn't do it. We had a team of accountants doing it. And it was very easy to sit down and be a manager if you had all the data presented to you. If you had to go and crunch the numbers, then be the manager as well, which is what we tend to have to do in agriculture, that, you know, and sweep up as we go. Do you know, it's actually too hard. They're different hats. You know, one's being a bookkeeper, one's being the manager. It's usually better to pay someone to bring that report to you so that you can sit down and have a management meeting. It needs to be all the decision makers and stuff. And the person, and then you just fill this out. So what was the variation to budget? You know, what was the cause of that? You know, was it late delivery? Was it you didn't get it off in time? Was it you needed more inputs? Then what are you going to do to return it to plan? So we don't complete the loop usually. So what action are you going to take to return it to plan? And who's going to do it and when? This needs a when on it as well. Who and when? One of the things I do is ever usually spent adverse to the budget, adverse to the plan, is responsible there. Their name goes in there first unless there's a really good reason. If you spend adverse to plan, you're responsible for getting it back on track, because that stops the conflict of, you know, you spent it, now I've got to fix it. Because usually what I find in most businesses is that the person that's spending adverse to plan is usually doing it because they go, it's for the business, and you know, it's the tax deductible. So you can't do that. So once you learn that you can't just buy things willy-nilly that for the business because they're tax deductible, a lot of these things start to fix. So that's usually in conflict with where people think money is going in the business. This shows where it's going and who's responsible for getting it back on track. It takes a lot of stress out of the business, but it's pretty confronting to start with. But you know, like once you're doing that, you've got to play the ball, not the man or woman in this. You've really just got to make sure that it's a business meeting. You know, I do the financials, I do what's happening with the land and the crops and the business, and I do, you know, something about well-being as well. So, you know, did we make some more plans or take some increasing landscape function? You know, have we got the money on track, and, you know, are the people on track? So, you know, so it can take some coaching. I used to do a lot of these, sort of felt like a referee until people got started. And then sort of that. But if you're struggling for profit, this is the most powerful thing to do. And it's taken me 25 years to get there. I thought it was about doing the budgeting, doing that. This is the key step. This is like the key step, or the main barrier to becoming profitable, is to be able to sit down, do variation to budget, identify the cause, and take action to return the budget to plan. So I strongly recommend that. These are the barriers. I've just tried to put it in just to include that off. So monthly monitoring and corrective action. People underestimate risk. They don't have a convenient infrastructure, the right animals, you know, getting that enterprise design so that you're working on redesign, not on substitution or efficiency. Getting confused between agronomy and business is a really big one. I've got to do this because the agronomist said is really, you know, like, and the classic one is planting crops that don't ever make a profit to get a disease break, and you'd be better off putting it back to perennial grass and getting a refresh of the soil, increasing the structure, and then cropping back into it again. And gross margin is usually unsuitable for designing a profit. You know, they just don't include enough of the costs in a cropping system. So, and there's someone else's safe to fail trials, not yours. Very good. That was all I had, Dan. Is there any questions or?
Sorry, Graeme, my phone was just ringing.
Nice.
I should put that on silent, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
So we've got a little bit of time if anyone's got any questions on that. I think it was a really good webinar again today, Graeme. Really good discussion on that soil carbon, which is on the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment, particularly around carbon credits and testing and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of people have got, well, I know a lot of our members have got a lot of questions and interest around that space. So it was great to touch on that, both from I suppose a cropping perspective, but also a grazing perspective as well. So
fantastic.
I think if there's no questions, I think we might wrap it up there. So thanks very much for your time again, Graeme. That's 5 out of 6 done. One more next week. I guess next week is a wrap-up week, is it? Or what have you got planned for next week?
And if people really want to send any questions or do any of that sort of work, just so that don't leave anything lying on there. I've made some big claims, and I'm really happy to support them and discuss them. So,
no, very good. No, thanks, Graeme, for your time. We'll see you next week. But big thank you again to the Wimmera CMA through the funding from Australian Government's National Landcare program. So thanks very much for your support to make this happen. Just some housekeeping things. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, we've got one final one next week. The survey will be attached that comes up in your window when you exit the webinar. So if you could complete that for us, that would be great. Thank you. That it is being recorded and will be available up on our YouTube channel. So if you missed it, or if you want to go back and review it, it will be there. So thanks very much for your time, Graeme, and we'll see you same time next week.
Thanks, sir.
See you, mate.